Moscow and Cairo. Old friends, but their relationship has been on the back burner for decades. Well, this is as a high-ranking Russian delegation visits Cairo. Reportedly, there's an arms deal worth $2 billion on the table. And joining me to discuss that tonight, William Jordan, a former official at the US State Department, Oleg KOBTZEFF, assistant professor at the American University of Paris in Tel Aviv. Ron Ben YISHAI is from Ynet News, and in Washington tonight, Tarek RADWAN is from the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much indeed to you all. I'm also going to introduce now Hala Mohyeddin. Hala, you've been looking at some of the online reaction and some of the columns as well to this story today.
I have indeed.
What have you got for us?
Well, we'll just start off with a quick look at Twitter. It's just starting to get warmed up on Twitter here. The reactions are fairly mixed, but people are, of course, focusing on this military aspect there. You can see photos being posted, Egypt and Russia in talks on military collaboration. And so reactions just starting to come out, but people are really taking the view that we are starting to get to the stage where it seems like Obama's just given up. He's just handed Egypt over to the Russians. But other commentators are taking a slightly more light-hearted look at it. One guy here saying, ever had an ex pretend to date someone else so you'd get jealous?
That's the jealous tryst that Tarek RADWAN was talking about earlier.
So that's
going out with someone to make someone else look jealous.
Well, this is it. It's something that I don't know if you've done it yourself. I certainly have, but it's
no comment.
You know, bringing it back down to that kind of level. So a slightly more light-hearted look at it. But people are starting to talk about the sort of this love triangle almost. But we do have one person, interestingly, saying that Russia and Egypt do have common views regarding solving the crisis in Syria, which is rather interesting. They're not known for sharing the same position.
That is interesting. Oleg, what do you think about that? I mean, how are the Russians viewed in Egypt, given their position on the conflict in Syria, do you think?
Not only in Egypt, but in the entire Middle East, there is still tremendous sympathy for Russia. It's a cultural thing, and that includes the young generation as well, who don't even remember Nasser or Hafez el-Assad, the father, when Russia was really very present there.
That's interesting. Okay.
Okay. Well, what this article is basically talking about is it's just a small snapshot here, but they're saying that both Russia and Egypt are pushing for a diplomatic solution. They really want these talks to go ahead. So they're saying we are starting to see a little bit of common ground. They want to move towards that common goal. Because
Russia, of course, has seized the diplomatic initiative when it comes to Syria over the United States. They, of course, got the chemical weapons disarmament program moving.
That's correct, which shows that one of their moves might be to show that they can be brokers. They have supported Bashar al-Assad, showing, on one hand, my ally, right or wrong. On the other hand, they have also shown that discussions and negotiations are still possible, therefore what places them, the Russians, as a possible broker in any deals between the United States, Middle Easterners, and other forces.
Okay.
Okay, now in addition to the look at the relationship between sort of how they're working in terms of foreign policy, the Huffington Post is also drawing attention to the fact that Egypt and Russia aren't really strangers. They were very, very close allies for 20 years back in the 60s, really. And they're pointing us towards the Ahram Online, which is showing us a series of photos of, here we have a Soviet actress and an Egyptian actress sort of hanging out in Moscow back in 64.
Both with the beehives.
Yeah, with the beehives there. We've got here we have a German cosmonaut, German Titov, who is being welcomed in Egypt. And of course, lots of photos, if we just scroll up towards the top there, of senior Russian officials meeting with senior Egyptian officials. And certainly lots of photos of the celebrations, lots of photo ops during the construction of the Aswan Dam there. Of course, a very important project helping with irrigation and power creation.
Yeah, it's a huge project, yeah.
So this is looking back at the historic angle. They're not strangers at all. They really are. They do have this close intertwined history. So it's just sort of reminding us of that fact. And it was only after Nasser's death that policy shift occurred when the new president, Anwar Sadat, came in. He was the one who ordered the Russians, the 20,000 Russian representatives out of Egypt and move towards that brokered deal. So that was when the foreign policy shift really came.
And I wonder if I can bring in Ron Ben YISHAI on that point. As we've just been talking about Russia and Egypt, they are old allies. Of course, Egypt used Russian arms to fight Israel in the war, in the Arab-Israeli war. Do you think that the Russians and the Egyptians becoming cozy again is making some people in Israel nervous?
No, not at all. On the contrary. Israel is more nervous about the fact that the Egyptians got sophisticated American weaponry rather than that they will get Russian weaponry. Although Russia can provide Egypt with some anti-aircraft and anti-missile missiles that can impair Israeli Air Force ability to act freely in case of war, a theoretical case of war. But I don't think that anyone in Israel is too nervous about it. First of all, because this a sudden rapprochement between the Egyptians and the Russians is not likely to take place. I don't want to spoil the to be a party spoiler, but look, the Russians are supporting a Shiite or Alawite, who is a sect among the Shiites, an Alawite regime, which is hated by the Sunni Muslim world. And if the Egyptians who are more secular, might tend to go towards the Russian or strike a deal with the Russians, the Saudis, that of course sanctions this move as a signal to the Americans, whom they are at odds at the moment, but the Saudis will not let the Egyptians go too far in their, as I said, rapprochement with the Russians. Excuse me.
We're all going back to the 1960s.
They are not Soviets. They are not.
That would be going back in time, wouldn't it? Okay, it's an interesting point that keeps coming up again and again. Yep. All right.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, finish your point, Ron.
Look, the Saudis are paying the bill for Egyptian food. They are paying now for wheat, for oil, for everything that Egypt badly, desperately needs. The Egyptians will not do anything, that will anger the Saudis.
Okay, all right. So it's a point that comes up again and again. The Egyptians aren't really going to buy these arms. This is all a big puff piece and people trying to make other people jealous and all the rest of it. But it has attracted a lot of criticism about US foreign policy in the region. And your final piece is on that, Hala.
It is. John McCain is using his usual diplomatic style here to compare John Kerry to a human wrecking ball. Now, this piece in The Atlantic is saying that they're not sure if this is based on the Miley Cyrus song that's just come out or whatever.
Probably not, I'm guessing.
But they're saying that, you know, the guy has been a human wrecking ball. I'm very disappointed. And he's going on to criticise several of Kerry's recent trips abroad. He says the whole policy in the Middle East is in such disarray. He's never seen anything like this before in his life. He's just absolutely incredulous here. We're flying into Riyadh, talking with the King of Saudi Arabia, going to Egypt and praising steps towards democracy. And he's saying that if America doesn't lead, then the bad guys will. He's like, it's historical fact. It's the way the world is today. So clearly feels very strongly about this.
Okay. All right, Hala, very interesting. Thank you very much. Hala Mohiuddin there. And William, I'm going to have to pick up your point, ask you about the point that Hala was just making there about how this has attracted a lot of criticism about US foreign policy. I mean, ironically, President Obama began his presidency in Egypt, didn't he, making a speech. Now it's being seen by some as the centrepiece of a policy just to disengage and not get involved anymore. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair. I would go even further. I would say that I think in many ways the chickens are coming home to roost for Washington as far as its policy in the Middle East. One of the signal features of the Obama administration has been its relative withdrawal from the region in terms of having any kind of a vision, strategy, or framework for its policy. The core issues that are important to the United States remain the same: energy security, the security of the State of Israel, and fighting against extremism, terrorism, and any other forces that might upset stability. But the approach has not taken into account things like the Arab Spring. It has not taken into account various things. It has not been able to adapt well, let's put it that way, to situations like like what we're seeing in Syria. It has not been able to adequately respond to what's happening in Egypt to be able to use its leverage to ensure that that process plays out peacefully in terms of the uprising and ultimate coup d'etat against President Morsi, constitutionally elected president of Egypt. And hence, I think, you know, it's absolutely true. I mean, you can go on and talk about Iran, you can go on and talk about Saudi Arabia, you can go on and talk about Turkey and other issues. But the point is, I mean, Secretary Kerry has been very active going out to the region and trying to patch things together. But in my view, what he has tended to demonstrate is less that activity is motivated by strategy or by a coherent vision of how things ought to be, but rather it's a panicked response to a region that, from the United States' point of view, is out of control.
Tarek, RADWAN, is it necessarily a bad thing for Egyptians if they are no longer dependent on one state for such a vast amount of aid? I mean, is it necessarily a bad thing that they are seeking to diversify, that they are talking to the Russians and they are talking to the Saudis? Some say it could, in fact, be good for their democracy as they move towards democracy. What's your view on that?
Well, actually, I think that their transition to democracy has far more to do domestically with than their international relations. I mean, of course, it's any country's right to diversify their international relations. I mean, that's you know a given. The fact that the Egyptians are flirting with the Russians is not a problem in and of itself, but it's really the Russians are not going to be the force that will push for human rights and democracy inside Egypt. I mean, the Russians said it themselves. They don't want to get involved in Egypt's domestic politics, and honestly, who could blame them? We've seen how messy that can be. But nonetheless, the United States plays an important role in pushing for these kinds of basic freedoms that other countries are less willing to do, lest it harm their strategic interests.
But Oleg, it doesn't seem to have worked so far. I mean, they've tried cutting aid, they've tried cajoling, they've tried...
What contradicts what Mr. RADWAN just said is that the United States basically supported a military coup against a constitutionally elected, or I mean, a democratically elected president. Now, we don't like that president, but unfortunately, the rules of democracy decided that that's the one who will be president. So, again, this creates an image of flip-flopping. I don't want to use George W. Bush's vocabulary that he directed against the same John Kerry, but unfortunately, that's the situation. That is how the Egyptians themselves and many other populations in the Middle East perceive the United States. Now, what I think is, Mr. YISHAI said it very well, even more stable and consistent than Russia is Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis are becoming, I think, the real arbitrators in the region, maybe more than the United States, and they can afford to do it.
I mean, the point is, the United States, Ron Ben YISHAI, perhaps you'd like to pick up on this point. The United States has been spending an awful lot of money on Egypt for an awfully long time. But when it came down to it, they really have very little influence over what goes on there. And it was, I mean, it was awkward is an understatement when, you know, to be on one side supporting a democratic uprising that's ousting your ally. I mean, the US has been caught wrong-footed throughout this, hasn't it?
No, no. The United States still exercise a lot of influence on the Egyptian military. Don't have a mistake. They still talk to them. They still talk to them on field level. How I don't know a better expression, but they're not talking. They're not talking diplomatically or foreign policy. They're talking of what do we do next. And I have a proof to that. And this is the fact that yesterday the Egyptian foreign minister declared the end of the emergency situation in Egypt. And they made a sort of a timetable for a new election. First of all, a new constitution, then in December, and then at the end, new election for president by mid next year, which means the American pressure is working on Egypt because the military is talking to the military or to the security establishment in the United States. And I would not go beyond that, but there is a lot going on between the United States and Egypt. So don't misunderstand. Under the surface, there is a lot going on between the United States and Egypt.
Tarek, RADWAN, do you agree with that? Do you think the United States still exercises a lot of influence over what goes on in Egypt?
Well, I think the United States exercises a lot of influence in particular sectors. I'll agree with our Israeli colleague that, definitely the military-military relationship is really the cornerstone of the United States-Egypt relationship, and it's that communication that where the United States can exert that kind of influence. When you get into domestic politics, it gets far more messy, far more complex. I don't think the United States wants to support a coup against a democratically elected president, but it's dealing with multiple forces right now that's kind of cornering its foreign policy in this area. And I absolutely agree. If there were a more coherent strategy, something that they could work for, then U.S. policy might be better situated to work towards that goal, towards democratic transitions. But the Obama administration has clearly gotten so frustrated. Obama himself even said at the UN General Assembly that he's chosen to take a step back to simplify his priorities in the region. But that doesn't mean that things still aren't going on behind the scenes, and hardly if any other country has spoken up about human rights, about the treatment of women, etc., I don't know about it.
Two remarks. One is that it's not only the military you need to be friends with if you want to have influence in the Middle East and in Egypt in particular. There's the population also to take into account. And right now, it's very good to have friends in the Egyptian military, but there's a population where a whole part of it is frustrated because their Muslim president has been ousted by a coup, and there's another population that is frustrated because we're back to a military regime that they didn't want in the first place. And the second remark is that precisely this is why, and here I agree with Mr. RADWAN, it's not a strategy that we need for Egypt. I'm speaking as an American. What we need is a real policy with a vision, as you have said earlier.
Can I just say, I think there's another aspect to this which people may not fully understand, and that is the Washington element. I mean, as has been sort of said already, I mean, you have the military with a very real stake in what's going on in Egypt, and with connections, as I alluded to earlier, that are deep and important. So does the CIA. So do a lot of other agencies of the U.S. government. Egypt has been for a long time the linchpin of America's presence and power projection politically in the region. The situation, though, in Egypt has become so unstable and so threatening to all of these interests that I believe it has thrown into turmoil the stakeholders in Washington to try to figure out what to do. And I would bet that one of the things that should be going on now, reevaluating the policy, it's been complicated by the the Iron Rice Bowl, or whatever you want to call it, bureaucratics involved, where people do not want to surrender their prerogatives. And then you have the added domestic political aspect of this. You mentioned John McCain criticizing John Kerry. The Congress of the United States, especially the Republicans, are watching very closely everything the Obama administration is doing, finding fault with every aspect of what its policy, especially in the Middle East, is involved. So you have constant criticism of the response to the coup d'etat in Egypt. You have also the criticism of the Iran policy at a time when the P5+1 are supposedly on the verge of some sort of an interim deal. You have questioning about the Arab-Israeli peace process through the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. You have a lot of criticism of what's going on with dealing with Syria, and then last, and let's not forget Benghazi.
Do you think that's unprecedented, though? Is this a new phase in U.S. politics? Is it not? Is U.S. foreign policy not usually subject to such scrutiny and such criticism?
The virulence of the pushback from the opposition party to what the President of the United States is supposedly laying down as the policy of the U.S., yes, that is somewhat unprecedented, because even though, and we saw this under George W. Bush, there was serious opposition to the Iraq War, it was initially rather muted, and indeed it took a back seat to a majority sentiment in favor. It is not generally in the DNA of American politicians to question the executive in the conduct of key foreign policy issues. But to get back to points that I and others have made, the administration in Washington has basically drifted and not provided the vision, leadership, and, as Oleg has just said, policy framework for anybody to really understand what Washington's objectives are, other than short-term management of a region that seems to be in crisis.
Is this an inevitable winding down of U.S. influence in this part of the world? And if so, what are the implications of that?
Honestly, I don't know, but I really completely agree with William Jordan here. It's completely unprecedented. There was a discipline. Everyone in Congress was behind the president in foreign policy, especially in difficult times, in times of instability. And for the first time, opposition expresses itself not only in domestic policies, but in a very virulent way, as you said, in foreign policy. And that is certainly not good for the image of the United States abroad. And that's Russia. Does Russia have a policy itself? That remains to be seen. But they're certainly using that opportunity. It's an open gate for them.
Ron Ben Yishai, I just want to talk about what's happening inside Egypt. I mean, how do people feel about their government looking around to spend $2 billion potentially on arms? And kind of moving from one sphere of influence to another? I mean, what Egypt really needs at the moment, clearly, is foreign investment in the economy. It needs some kind of economic reform. I mean, how do you see this playing out further down the road?
To be honest with you, I don't know. Predicting what will be in the future in Egypt is beyond me, and I don't want to say something that doesn't have at least some base in facts. And this is the answer to your question. I don't know. What Egypt needs now badly, as you pointed out, is a boost to its economy. They are, without the Saudi money or the Qatar money and the Kuwaiti money, they would simply starve these days. So what they need is to streamline their economy again and go on. And by the way, the Egyptian military is holding a lot of Egypt's economy in its hands. Egypt needs badly a new tourism wave, but there will be no tourism if they will not be able to reinstate personal security. So they have so many challenges. I don't think that the Egyptians will be looking too much to what happens between Egypt and the Soviet Union, or and the Russians.
You're determined to take us back to the Cold War, Rod. All right, we've run out of time.
What can I do?
We've run out of time. We're going to have to leave it there.
You got my message.
We got the message loud and clear. Ron, thank you very much indeed. Ron Ben YISHAI, William Jordan, Oleg KOBTZEFF, and in Washington tonight, Tarek RADWAN as well. Thank you to you at home for watching. And we'll be back at the same time tomorrow for The World This Week. Don't miss that. This is France 24.
How do you make ends meet on less than 800 euros a month in France? This is the reality for Mayenne, Emily, Noel and Kevin. In and out of work, they make up a new class of poverty. Due to part-time contracts, illness or divorce, their daily lives have become an uphill struggle. France 24 finds out how financial adversity is becoming the new norm. Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.